Hello, students. Welcome to our first lesson for Unit 2. This unit, we skipped Chapter 3, um, and this unit is going to be from Chapters 4 and 5. And for this lesson, we're going to focus on the moral act itself and how Catholics look at the moral act systematically. And that gives us a way to use reason in order to understand whether or not the acts we're doing or the choices we're making are right or wrong. And this particular section is from pages 147 through 152 of your textbook. Okay, the first thing we need to do is talk about our learning objectives. What we're going to do to begin with is in class we're going to be playing Kahoot. And we're going to be reviewing what sin is and the different types of sin. And if you're absent, this Kahoot is posted on PowerSchool, and you can challenge yourself at home and just review your understanding of sin. In your book, this is actually incorrect. It's pages 131 through 139. We are just reviewing it because based on what you have done already in your classwork and in your tests, you seem to have a very strong understanding of what sin is. So we can just review that concept. But for this lesson, we are going to define the parts of the moral act, the moral object, the intent, and the circumstances. Identify the parts of the moral act from examples. And you will be given an assignment where you will apply the definitions that you know to examples. And then finally, explain the role each part of the moral act plays in determining culpability. And the word, if you don't know what culpability means, it means responsibility. So you're going to be able to explain what is the role of intention, circumstance, and the moral object itself. What role does each of those factors play in determining the degree to which one is responsible for what they've done? Okay, yes, as I said before, the first thing we're doing in class is reviewing the nature of sin by playing this Kahoot. And the one thing that I did want to make sure that everybody realized, you can play this Kahoot on PowerSchool. The link is on the PowerSchool page. If you're on the PowerSchool page, the column to the far right has the link with all the resources for this unit. But one thing I wanted to make sure to point out to everybody is that one thing students have said so far in class that I didn't correct because I didn't really feel it was time yet is most of you know that there's different degrees of sin. There's mortal sin, and then there's venial sin. Trying to look venial, VENIN, whoops, IA, venial. So venial sin. Mortal sin means that you have broken your friendships with God. And you've done something that would damage your friendships and lose your friendship with God. Venial sin would damage it, but you wouldn't lose the friendship. So mortal sin causes you to lose your friendship with God. And there are three things, three factors in determining mortal sin, and this is on page 137 of your book. For a sin to be mortal, it must be grave matter. Grave, and by grave they mean just serious. It must be committed with full knowledge. So you're completely aware of what you're doing, and you're completely aware that it is gravely sinful. And then finally, you have to have deliberate consent. So you know what you're doing, and you're choosing deliberately to do it. Now, one of the things students have said in class or written in their responses is, for example, they'll make the argument that uh, in the case of perhaps deliberate consent, if a person was coerced, like the example they gave in your book was a woman lies. We know that's an objective moral evil to lie under oath. It says that in the catechism. But she's lying because mobsters are threatening her family. The question becomes is does she have deliberate consent? Is she really free to choose this? No, because she has a mitigating factor that's inhibiting her ability to freely consent to what she's doing. She's being coerced. Now, some students have said that means she isn't sinning. Now, that's where the mistake is. Or some have argued that if the person didn't have full knowledge, then that means they didn't commit a sin. That's not exactly the best way to articulate that. Suppose a person doesn't realize that perhaps one common one that I've heard a lot is there are many Catholics who do not know that using contraceptive is considered a grave moral evil. So it's considered a mortal sin. So if you had, for example, a Catholic couple who was married and they're using contraception and they find out that they are committing a grave moral evil, that doesn't mean that because they didn't know it wasn't a sin to use contraceptive. No, that's considered an objective moral evil. Rather, what it means is what is normally considered a mortal sin becomes at is to the gets knocked down, so to speak, to the level of venial sin. So as it says here in the textbook on page 137, when one of these three conditions outlined above is not fully present, the sin in question is called venial. And remember, venial sins are sins that harm our friendship with God, but don't completely break the bond with God. Why do we have these two different levels of sin? What does this mean? So first of all, there's a certain amount of sense. It makes sense to differentiate between mortal and venial sins because it's basic common sense to look at some sins are to say some sins are worse than others. There's a big difference between, say, cheating on your wife and maybe just thinking about it. So we have to kind of look honestly at the idea that some sins are worse than others. Um, Another practical reason this is important is for venial sins. You can just pray to God yourself, say, Lord, I realize I committed a sin. Please forgive me. But with mortal sin, because the bond of friendship is severed with God through our actions, because the essential nature of sin is basically to say, God, I know that you love me and I know you want what's best for me, but I don't want it. So when we do that through our actions, the only way to repair the relationship is through the sacrament of confession or reconciliation. And so if you commit a mortal sin, you do need to seek reconciliation and receive the sacrament of reconciliation through confession. And that brings us back into God's grace, and we're back in harmony with God. So I just wanted to point that out. It's a subtle distinction, but I think it's an important one. So if you have any questions on that, please let me know. Okay, now we're going to start breaking down the different parts of the moral act. The reason we do this is it allows us to use our reason and our intellect to come to a conclusion about what is right and what is wrong. So in the same way that we break down algebra equations and solve them piece by piece, there's an order of operations to math. We're going to do the same thing here with ethics. We're going to look at the component parts of the moral of a moral action, and that will help us to determine whether things are right or wrong. The first part is the moral object. This is the act itself, or the end towards which the act is inherently ordered. So this is the what. What did I do? I, lied to my mom so I could sneak out of the house. I cheated on a test because I was afraid to fail. Um, Here in the Catechism, they remind us a morally good act requires the goodness of the object, the end, and the circumstances together. An evil end corrupts the action even if the object is good in itself, such as praying and fasting in order to be seen by men. We'll talk a little bit more about the relationship between the moral object and the end, which is part of the circumstances, and the and also the intention. But again, we want to try to have it good throughout. So the act itself is a good thing, like praying, but um, we also want to make sure the intentions are good as well, and the circumstances. So the Catechism continues: the object of the choice can by itself vitiate an act entirely. What that means is it can spoil it. So there are some concrete acts, such as fornication, that means sex outside of marriage, that it is always wrong to choose, because choosing them entails a disorder of the will, that is, a moral evil. And so what they mean by that, again, this is what we looked at before. We said there are certain things that are objectively evil or intrinsically evil. And these actions we saw before listed in the Catechism. Some of the other ones: fornication, murder, abortion, perjury, uh, I think, I'm not sure if adultery was on that list as well. These are what we call objective moral evils. So it doesn't matter how good your intentions are. It doesn't, matter. For example, with fornication, most people who have sex outside of marriage, they usually have good intentions. They want to express their love for their boyfriend or girlfriend. That's a nice thing to do. But God ordered um, sex, the love expressed through sex, to happen within a marriage. And so, for that reason, fornication is considered something that is always wrong, because the whole ordering of sex is to happen within marriage. That's part of God's plan for marriage. And so we always, want to make sure that the moral object is good. And so we're going to talk a little bit more in a future lesson about, well, how do we know if the object is good, right, or wrong? We'll talk more about the conscience and how that works. But for now, just remember that the moral object is the act itself. What did I do? Okay, the next part of the moral act is the intention. Why did the person do what they did, or why did you do what you did? Another word would be like the motive. Sometimes in court cases, that's the language they'll use. So your intentions reside in the will of the person acting, and that's what we call the person acting, the subject. So because the intention resides in the will, we call this the subjective dimension of, not reality, of morality. And the reason for that is the only way we can know someone's intention is if they tell us. And obviously, people can lie. This was one of the things Kant was concerned with. He was really concerned with people having pure intentions. And that's why he came up with the idea of the categorical imperatives. They have to be followed always, no matter what. And so it takes it takes out some of the guesswork about whether or not a person, has good or bad intentions, because you follow those categorical imperatives no matter what, and they will always kind of keep our will steady. So as I was saying, the legal system recognizes motive as a factor as well. And this is going to be an important thing when we're talking about what people do. So what is the difference between first degree murder and manslaughter? In both cases, what's the consequence of the act? Someone dies, right? Um, so the consequence is the same, and uh, the consequence is the same, and the moral act may be the same as well. So maybe the moral act was I shot a man in my house. I shot someone, and the consequence was he died. The intentions in each case and the circumstances are going to be key here. So, what if, in the case of one example, first degree murder, I shot my husband who came into the house uh, because I was sick of him and I wanted the insurance money, right? Um, so that would be first degree murder. What if, on the other hand, I shot my husband when he was coming into the house um, because I thought he was a burglar and I thought that I was going to be killed? Um, no, that's not an example. Next is our intention. This is the why, or the motive of our actions. So this resides in the will of the person acting, and so, or the subject. So this is sometimes called the subjective dimension of morality. So, and the reason for that is basically because nobody really knows your intentions but you. No one else can see inside your heart. And so God knows and you know, but intentions are really easy to lie about. We can't sometimes even lie to ourselves about why we do things, but our intentions should always be good. And so even the legal system recognizes the role motive plays in action. There's a difference between first degree murder, so it's premeditated and there's malice of forethought. You have malintentions and manslaughter. Um, so, for example, suppose a woman, runs her husband over with her car. There's a big difference between, say, a woman who intended to kill her husband so she could get the life insurance, and a woman who, didn't intend to kill her husband. She, didn't see him behind the car and accidentally ran him over. So, each woman is going to be held blameworthy to a different degree because one woman intended to kill her husband while the other didn't. This can include a series of actions to one end, and it can involve more than one intention. So sometimes an example that you might use is perhaps someone's going to rob a bank. Well, you know, they can, intend, there's going to be like kind of a series of actions. So like they get in their car and they drive, um, you know, they drive to the bank. At that point, they haven't, intended the robbery. So there's a series of actions with different intentions. And then sometimes, and I think very often, we can have more than one intention. So maybe, um, you help a friend study for a test, and that's a good thing. But maybe the other reason why you're overstudying and help her studying is because you have a crush on her brother and you want to have more time to hang out with your brother. So there's two motives there. One is to help your friend, but you also have a selfish motive to try to get a chance to maybe ask her boyfriend, her brother out on a date. Um, Here are two rules for governing intentions. Um, two rules are keep your intentions good and remember the end does not justify the means. So just because the result is good doesn't mean the means are good. So we always have to be asking ourselves and questioning ourselves about our intentions. Um, so let's go on to the next part. All right, next is circumstances. And the circumstances are the part of the moral decision making where people usually get sidetracked. Remember, we need to use reason to understand what's right or wrong. So what happens is circumstances often tug at our emotions. And depending on different circumstances, this is where people's emotions kind of hijack reason, and people start doing things um, for reasons for you know reasons that aren't reasonable, basically. So remember, circumstances are secondary elements. They're like who, where, when, how. And some of this does overlap with intentions and with the moral object itself. These aren't like cookie cutter, completely separate things. But remember, the circumstances, this is from the Catechism, including the consequences, are secondary elements of the moral act. And this is the part I think that really trips people up. Um, Again, the ends don't justify the means. Um, Even if the ends are good, uh, if you use evil means to achieve them, what you've done is wrong. And this is again, when we look at circumstances, people get stuck up in their emotions, and sometimes when we think with our emotions, we do things that aren't reasonable. Now, where circumstances are important, it comes to they increase or decrease the moral goodness or evil of human acts. So, for example, the amount of a theft. So, if you have someone steal $100 and someone steal $5, the circumstances there are key. Even in the courts, we realize this. There are different punishments for people who steal different amounts of money. They can also diminish or increase the responsibility um, of an agent, the responsibility an agent has for his or her actions. So this is what we talked about before in the beginning of the lecture when we talked about sin. So for instance, given circumstances, if the example they like to use in the book is there's a big difference between a 14-year-old who is pressured by her friends and her family to get an abortion. Maybe she even is living in poverty herself and can't figure out how to support a baby, and a woman who's a lawyer has a good job, she's 32, um, the level of responsibility there is not going to be the same. A 14-year-old girl doesn't have the emotional capacity or maturity that a 32-year-old lawyer has. So while just in both cases the sin of abortion is wrong, it's an intrinsic moral evil. But there's a degree to which you're held responsible for things. The level of responsibility would be different in the case of the 14-year-old compared with the case of the 22-year-old. So circumstances themselves cannot change the moral quality of acts themselves. They can make neither good or right in action that is itself evil. And so we have to always keep our focus on that. Again, a lot of times the circumstances, people get bogged down in them, almost like being bogged down in the weeds or something, or this expression, you can't see the forest through the trees. We have to always remember that no matter, as the book says, how grave or outlandish the circumstances surrounding a moral object, it's never in change an inherently moral object, inherently evil object into a good one. And one of the things we should always remember, sometimes we're judging moral acts after the fact, but when we're trying to make a decision, always think of alternatives, especially if you're in a really tough spot. And a lot of times we get myopic, meaning we only see one solution. So, for example, maybe you're really struggling to get an A in your foreign language class. Foreign language for most people is very difficult, and you've been really studying, and your mom is on your case about the grade. You can't go to prom unless you get that grade up or something like that. You have a lot of pressure under those circumstances, and sometimes people will think to themselves, well, I have to cheat. There's no other way out of the situation. But again, always think of alternatives. There's almost never a case where you only have one option. And this is why reason is so important. When we are being judging with our emotions, that's when we make mistakes. That's when we can't think clearly. Our emotions actually can hijack our thinking part of our brain. When you start releasing, those different hormones, it makes it difficult to think. You get in this flight or fight mode, and logic kind of flies out the window. So that's why it's really important to break down the moral acts um, this way, because it makes it easier for us to be rational and use reason rather than just our emotions. Okay, now what we're going to do now is a check for understanding. You're going to do classwork 9. It's on Power School, and you're going to identify the parts of the moral act. Everyone needs to complete their own worksheet and submit it to Power School when they're done. But you can collaborate and work with your team members to help you go through the worksheet. Again, it's called Classwork 9. It's on the Unit 2 page on Power School. I'll just show you the first part of it. This is what it looks like. Okay, this is Classwork 9. And again, it's on Power School. And you'll see the instructions here. Read the hypothetical situations below and identify the different parts of the moral act, and then evaluate the morality of the act by completing the chart for each situation. Each situation is worth 15 points for a total of 75 points for this assignment. So you get a little bits of points for each part. So it's really important that you complete the whole thing. Some guiding questions you can ask yourself to try to help you. Again, we haven't talked about conscience yet and how to use it, but this is mainly about breaking down actions into their component parts. So some questions you can use to help yourself are, Do the cases involve objects that are morally bad? Did any of the cases involve evil intentions? Or do the people involved desire the evil effects that would be produced by their decisions? Or are they, as it were, unwanted products of their decisions? So this is a nuanced question we can ask that kind of helps us think about the role intention plays. Because sometimes people, there will be bad results of an action, but they were never intended. That's what intended. That's what we call the double effect. And we'll talk more about that as we look at more specific issues. But if the acts or intentions are good, but the act has good and bad effects, is the good intended by the act proportionate to the bad effect? Um, and so this is another nuance. So uh, one of the things that we have to acknowledge is sometimes the act itself, or especially the effects, are both good and bad, right? And this is where sometimes people say, oh, it's a gray area. And usually when people use that expression, it's usually like a cop out, like, oh, it's a gray area. And it almost implies that I really don't have to think about it then. Well, no, we can use the idea of proportionality. So take the example of dropping the atom bomb in World War II. That had, the technically that's considered an intrinsic moral evil because it killed innocent people. But when we look at like the consequences and their intentions, they're a little bit muddy, right? So the question becomes, yes, ending the war is a good intention, but we have to look at proportionality. Was the good that came from dropping the atom bomb proportionate to the evil that happened as a result? And so that's something we sometimes have to think about with really complex and situations that have a lot of gray areas. So again, we don't just throw up our hands and say, oh, it's too hard to figure out. No, let's look at proportionality. Let's try to figure this out. Again, Catholics aren't afraid of reason. We don't just give up. We say, let's dig in and understand this problem. So you have these different situations. Here's situation one, and these are really brief, and they don't have a lot of detail because, again, I just want you to break down the actions. And this here is just a little bit of practice, and we'll work more on this later. So let's just do situation one together. So Molly wants to help a friend get a job. So she tells a little lie when filling out the reference form. So now you got to look at the part. The moral object. What did she do? She lied, right? Now this is where sometimes people get confused. Some students will say, and when I ask what's the object, they'll say she wants to help her friend to get a job. That's not the object. That's not what she did. What she did was lie, and it says little white lie. But again, that's part of the circumstances. Okay, that's not the act. The act is lying. Is lying good or bad? It's bad. How do I know that? Because the Ten Commandments teach me that. Even if I wasn't Christian, the natural moral law teaches us that it's wrong to lie, because if we lie, then no one could be trusted, and we couldn't have, a social relationship with people if everyone's going to lie. What are the intentions? She wants to help her friend. So she wants to help. Is that a good thing? Yeah, that's a good thing. What are the circumstances? So she tells a small lie on a reference form. So I'm just writing little notes there. So she tells a small lie on a reference form. So are the circumstances good or bad? This is where sometimes, again, this is where people have a difficult time. Um, you may not say they're completely good or completely bad. You might say that what she did was wrong, but it was a small lie. So it could be worse. She could have really exaggerated, but she falsifies a reference form. So this is It's something that's bad, but we acknowledge that it could be worse. Mitigating factors. Are there any factors that would mitigate the blameworthiness? So here we might say, well, her intentions are good. It's not like she lied on the form so her friend wouldn't get the job because she wants to stab her in the back. Also, it's a small lie. So she could have told a big lie. So there's, differing degrees to which we can uh, falsify the truth. So those might mitigate her blameworthiness in this case. Um, Now, again, just because she has good intentions doesn't mean, and her friend getting the job, if her, she might say, well, my friend got the job. Well, no. Again, just because the consequence was good doesn't make lying good. Lying is still wrong. Okay, so that's what we're kind of getting at. So, was the action morally right or morally wrong, and why? And so this is where you'll explain and make sure you cite evidence from the object, the intention, and the circumstance to help make your case. And so you're going to practice with your family doing the rest. Again, try not to get bogged down too much in the circumstances. And then we'll go over this. In the next lesson, we'll be moving on to looking at how do we, what informs our, we're going to look first at natural moral law, and then we're going to look at the conscience. So, how do I know what's good or bad? Your conscience is going to tell you. And so we'll look at how that works next. Um, uh, but before we look at that, we need to look at the natural moral law, because the natural law is this sort of uh, guiding principle that the conscience taps into to help us understand what's right and wrong. So again, I wanted to start here because we got to have our little system defined first. Then we can start looking at more about how we can use our conscience alongside this system to understand ethics. If you have any questions, please let me know.